Goblin Slayer is a light novel port of the overdone fantasy genre, complete with magic, guilds, quests, and a pointless ranking system, pretending it's not an isekai because no one fell from the sky. The show follows the creatively named Goblin Slayer, though you wouldn't know from the first 11 minutes, since it prefers to skip world and character building in order to bait to controversy. For being such a contentious topic upon release, I couldn't find myself mortified by the brutalization and rape depicted in episode 1, since the former I was already numb to from countless other shows, and the latter provided me with decent material. It doesn't help that I barely knew these dumb schmucks for 5 minutes before they happily gallivanted along into a spooky cave full of rapey bastards. These lobotomites might as well have been isekai'd for how utterly clueless about their world they are, though it's difficult to blame them when even the audience is left in the dark. I suppose their deadly exertion functioned as a vehicle to demonstrate how unforgiving the world is to naivety and foolish heroics. And fair enough, but since they weren't allowed the decency of being named, I wasn't invested in the slightest during the exenteration and despoliation. The priest girl survives, and despite being only metaphorically face-fucked, she's all gung-ho about setting off on more adventures the very next day. You'd think what should have been a lifelong trauma would have shaken her a bit more. But hey, maybe she's more resolute than she looks despite being a helpless, sobbing mess before getting her ass carried. As far as I can tell, her bravado stems from her newly purchased chainmail, because prancing around Reddit armed with nothing but a sundress and a vagina seemed like such a good idea before. That, or it's her new husbando, the titular dungeon surveyor, who swooped in like the situational deity he is and rescued her, but not before dispatching the nice guys with his glowing sans eye. All in all, episode 1 teaches the viewer that Goblin's bad, which anyone could have gleaned from their design alone, but whatever, you got media attention, so congratulations on your 15 minutes, Goblin Slayer. And boy, did it need that coverage, because after this, the show devolves into your typical mediocre fantasy romp. Okay, that's not fair. Goblin Slayer does set itself apart in one particular area. Namely, the Grim Reaper of Green Men doesn't fall into the conventions of your usual protagonist. His atypical fixation on low-level fodder, juxtaposed against the more generic backdrop of larger-than-life glory hunters, makes for fun and interesting interactions between characters. We found the leader of the goblins. He's an ogre, you say. And like that, you've lost me. Hey, Goblin Slayer, I have a request for you. Does it involve goblins? No, but bye, loser. Scenes like this are easily my favorite part of the show. It's fun watching Goblin Slayer fumble his way through conversations, or act utterly apathetic towards anything outside his immediate area of expertise. Seeing your standard fantasy characters react to his aloof and reserved demeanor is surprisingly entertaining, not to mention his extreme pragmatism as he clobbers the robbers. While a high elf stylishly snipes the little gremlins with her bow, he would cut open the corpses and use their blood to mask his scent. While over-encumbered 20-somethings try to rip off better characters, Goblin Slayer uses lightweight armor and a short sword so he won't be hindered in the claustrophobic caves goblins tend to nest in. He's never above using weapons from fallen enemies and will burn them alive if it would be efficient. These traits exemplify what I believe to be the theme of Goblin Slayer: utility over presentation. Goblin Slayer does everything he can to maximize his chances of success against the little urchins. Worrying about appearance or popularity is not conducive to that end. His various quirks and methods differentiate him from other fantasy leads, and I can appreciate that. But Hyman Humidifier isn't free of similarities to his standard counterparts, most apparently in his overwhelming sex appeal despite being as sociable as a misanthrope that thinks intercourse is another word for transit. Every walking vagina wants his dick inside them, speaking only to sing his praises or get overtly horny. They exist either as potential or previous victims of surprise penetration from the plundering perpetrators, but I digress. I'm also irked by expeditive soothsayer's precognitive perception. At times, the man inexplicably has 20/20 foresight and knows precisely what to bring along on his murder picnics. Am I supposed to believe the one time he brings a canary to sniff out poison gas is also the first and last time the goblins ever use poison gas? It's already obvious that the fabric of this show is sewn for the sole purpose of making the kobold cremator seem cunning and experienced, but moments like this make it blisteringly apparent the sewer has never threaded a needle. Despite my gripes, it is somewhat fun to forget logic and relish in the pest control. We see the dynamic between him and his cult following in action, as he demonstrates his pirate evisceration proficiency. Though I am hesitant to call Goblin Slayer's sidekicks characters when you could have pulled them from any other fantasy setting. Oh, you're a 2,000-year-old elf girl with just as many years of experience with a bow, but only the maturity and appearance of someone less than 100th of your age? What the hell, I buy it. An overweight manlet ripped straight from Lord of the Rings, a random lizard humanoid obsessed with cheese, and the only thing uniting these three is their mutual worship of Goblin Slayer as some sort of urban legend. They're never allowed much character outside of their ties to the goblin fetishist, and that's the biggest problem I have with Goblin Slayer. Removing the main character highlights how vapid the rest of the cast is without his presence. Suddenly, what I'm watching becomes indistinguishable from its contemporaries, and I wonder if I accidentally click on an episode of Tales of Magic, Medieval, and Misogyny in Another World. The dynamic between Goblin Slayer and everyone else is as imperative to this show as blood circulation is to the human body. Without the former, you tend to feel not very good. Unsurprisingly, subtracting Goblin Slayer from Goblin Slayer effectively guts the best element of the show. And speaking of guts, Putrefaction Purveyor bears a striking resemblance to his inspirations, except a bit more calculated and slightly less angry. Overpowered, dark and mysterious, revels in the slaughter, drinks dry shots of protein powder, you get the idea. His backstory is really boring. Who would have guessed that his perverted love for turning goblin sphincters inside out stems from a tragic childhood memory where he had to watch his loved ones succumb to the fate of all main character flashback families? Nothing says these people are going to die like a loving environment and a bad filter. The finale was so obvious that you... Almost every episode, we're shown Border Enforcer patrolling the farm he lives on for signs of goblin activity in case the impish crusaders mistake it for their holy land. His efforts pay off when he discovers Cheeto dust in cum-stained socks near the property line. He attempts to persuade the cardboard backdrop of a cast to aid his extermination campaign, and initially they laugh it off because he's the funny helmet man. But after one powerful speech and a hefty bribe from his chief dick rider, Goblin Slayer convinces them to help. During the battle, these high and mighty adventurers learn the lesson the rest of us figured out in episode 1, that goblins bad and you shouldn't underestimate them, pounding that nail even further into the drywall of the cast. Of course they win, the day is won, everyone's happy, the end. I just hope Pussy Slayer had the foresight to bring condoms to the after party. Overall, I give Goblin Slayer 4 dead goblins out of 10. It's not terrible, it had substantial things to say about the boons of form over function and needlessly fretting over aesthetics, but the show could have been better if it included more of Goblin Slayer, and less of everything else. Still, if the idea of a bargain bin angry man teaching goblins a harsh lesson on the definition of cannon fodder sounds interesting, then hey, knock yourself out. And remember, boys and girls, the only good goblin is a dead goblin.